We appear from the dark. I'm Helen Evans, and I'm delighted and honored to introduce Andrea Achi tonight, my successor at the Met as the Mary and Michael Jaharis Curator for Byzantine Art. She will talk this evening about her exhibition, Africa and Byzantium, now on view at the museum. Holland Cotter, the senior art reviewer for the New York Times, praised Africa and Byzantium highly as it opened for bringing together stunning works of art to offer new insights into their history and significance. The great historian of late antiquity, Peter Brown, described it as a superb exhibition in his laudatory review in the New York Review of Books. And the exhibition's forthcoming review in the March issue of The Atlantic is titled, "The Disorienting Beauty of Africa and Byzantium. The landmark exhibition offers a new history of art." Not surprisingly, the art magazine Apollo just named Andrea as one of the 40 leading thinkers among museum curators under 40. I tell you this to assure you that others admire Andrea's work as much as I do. At the Met, she will ensure that the world of Byzantium and Hellenism will continue to be an important aspect of the study of art and culture of the medieval world as our concepts of history and art history are transformed. As the reviewers often note, Africa and Byzantium continues the tradition of groundbreaking Byzantine exhibitions that the Met has held since 1997. The Glory of Byzantium, Byzantium Faith and Power, Byzantium and Islam, and Armenia all demonstrated the importance of all the centuries of the empire's long life and its influence throughout the known world of its time. Africa and Byzantium takes us further. Andrea and I met when she came to be my research intern in 2014. Then she was a graduate student at the Institute of Fine Arts, where she did her dissertation on manuscripts from the Coptic monastery of St. Michael in Egypt, works you can see in Africa and Byzantium. She became interested in Egypt as a child when her family visited there. In college at Barnard, she studied the classics, an enthusiasm encouraged by her grandmother, who taught Greek and Latin at Xavier University in New Orleans. While in college, and continuing today, she participated in archaeological digs in Italy and Egypt, and like many of us, her interests shifted as she studied. In her case, from the heyday of the world of Greece and Rome to its last centuries, as the gods of the past gave way to Christianity. As you will hear now, Africa and Byzantium begins with that world and follows it through to today. Andrea.
Thank you so much, Helen. And thank you, everyone, for having me here tonight. So what I'm going to do today is give you really a tour of the exhibition, Africa Byzantium, which sheds new light on the staggering artistic achievements of medieval Africa. This long overdue exhibition offers a more complete history of the vibrant multi-ethnic societies of North and East Africa that shaped and helped the artistic and economic and cultural life of Byzantium and beyond. The exhibition traces 3 artistic arcs, which are divided into 3 sections in the exhibition. The first section of the exhibition focuses on Africa and late antiquity. And this part of the talk explores the significant role of wealthy patrons, artists, and leaders of Northern Africa in shaping late antiquity's visual and intellectual culture. So here, I'll focus on the art of the centuries when much of North Africa was under the rule of the Byzantine Empire from its capital, Constantinople. But I will also discuss Tunisia and Egypt from the 2nd to the 7th century. And on the screen, you see a beautiful photo of Carthage and the Mediterranean. The second section, Bright as the Sun, demonstrates how Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia, respectively, maintain relationships with Byzantium through intellectual and artistic engagement and reimaginings of Byzantine visual culture. The relationship between Islam, which gradually became the dominant religion in the region by the 9th century, and Christian communities are explored through themes of gift exchange and diplomacy. The final section, Legacy, centers primarily on Ethiopia. So here you'll see painted wood panels and manuscripts from the early modern period that show how the visual tradition of Ethiopian Christianity flourished by emphasizing the memory of Byzantium well after the fall of the empire. The exhibition also closes with installations by contemporary artists, Sade Makonnen and Teo Shettu, and I'll discuss how their engagement with cultural patrimony, heritage, and memory brings the exhibition's themes into the present day. So throughout this talk, I reflect on themes of identity, authority, and memory. So for example, in late antique Africa, elites forged a shared identity around the consumption and presentation of wealth. And later, communities across North Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia formed new communities around distinct regional expressions of the Christian faith. And Byzantine political authority shifted and then gradually waned in northern and eastern Africa, but we know that the Orthodox communities flourish in these regions. Northern African elites, patrons, drove the production of much of the area's extant visual and material cultures. Like most borders in the Roman and the Byzantine periods, the boundaries of the African provinces of the empire expanded and waned. And this region in Africa contained some of the most prosperous and urbanized regions. North Africa was long recognized for its importance in long-distance trade and then also its place in the Mediterranean economy. By the Byzantine period, there were 8 provinces in northern Africa, in addition to the provinces of Egypt stretching from Morocco to the Red Sea. And so the shaded area is the largest expanse of Byzantium in the 6th century. This region in Africa contained some of the most prosperous provinces, and the entire empire recognized its importance in long-distance trade and its place in the Mediterranean economy. So Carthage, particularly, was an important Byzantine city. Oil, grain, and fine wares left its ports to be dispersed across the world. So the remarkable objects in this first section of the exhibition demonstrates the wealth and status of the diverse communities between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And the objects explore how different multi-faith cultural influences were adapted to unique regional taste, including Christian aesthetics, Greek traditions, and the underexplored connections between the different religious communities in the area. North African artisans produced exquisite mosaics, and that rivaled those from other Roman and early Byzantine artistic production centers throughout the empire. But the region's artists developed original ethnographic themes adapted from Greek traditions and catered to unique regional taste. For example, from the Carthage Museum in Tunisia, you'll see the personification of Carthage. This mosaic was discovered in a large villa estate in Tunisia. The haloed woman, you'll see she's gesturing her right hand with a sign of blessing, and she holds a scepter and her scepter in her left hand, and that's a sign of political authority. This masterpiece represents a pinnacle of African mosaics produced in the Vandal period when Tunisian mosaicists merged 2 artistic trends. So traditional North African styles with Byzantine ethnography. And this mosaic type appeared as part of the artistic and urban renewal in Africa in the 4th and 5th centuries. So we also have African red slipware, which was exported from Africa and circulated on complex trade networks throughout the Byzantine Mediterranean sphere. And I think I just missed that slide, which is here. And on the top, you can see right here where those trade networks really went across the Mediterranean world. I mean, there was African red slipware all the way from Britain to the Balkan Sea. There is African red slipware even in the Russian areas. But these glossy red ceramics from North Africa have been found in abundance at late antique archaeological sites from Rome to Constantinople. Their dispersion across the Western and Eastern Mediterranean represents Africa's prosperity in the late Roman world. These distinct wares were imitation of luxury silver vessels, but were still considered to be fine tableware in the late antique period. And so these are vessels right here that the African red slipware were imitations of. Successful pottery workshops in the province in Byzantine Africa withstood the volatile political upheavals of the region during the late Roman, then Vandal, which is 5th century, and then the early Byzantine period, so the 6th century. So one of the most well-known pottery centers in Tunisia was a workshop called Navigas. Pottery from the workshop was either stamped or incised with the word navigi at the vessel's neck. So and you can see this actually on the middle vessel where it was incised. Though the mass of vessels from this workshop have been found mostly in central Tunisia, similar workshops made exports that were discovered in Egypt, Italy, the lower Danube region, Anatolia, the Levant. And by the mid-20th century, scholars of Roman and then early Byzantine archaeology began to appreciate the importance of the African imports at sites across the Mediterranean basins to the Black Sea regions. So these imported African red slipwares were mostly plates and bowls. And the open form of the vessels allowed them to be stacked and transported easily with other imports from North Africa, such as grain and oro. But wine jugs and bottles, however, did not travel well on ships, and so those have been mostly found at domestic and funerary sites in North Africa, and so that's the reason why I have them here in the exhibition. So these closed-form wares often were red-orange or red-brown, and they were made with intricate molds. Usually 2 or 3 pieces were joined and then smoothed together before firing. And the potters created the hair in these separately, using something called a trail slip technique to form the individual curls. And often, the fingerprints of the potters who carefully rubbed off the excess clay can be seen on the side of the vessels. And so when you come to the exhibition, I invite you to really look closely at the cases because you can really see the fingerprints. The themes from the wares range from classical figures, such as Dionysian retinue, to these strange depictions of faces. The intricate scenes were not narratives, rather they were pictorial snapshots of well-known characters, such as Orpheus, Mercury, Dionysus, Victory with Maenads and Satyrs. And the Hellenistic iconography connects to a tradition that reflects the portraits. It reflects the appreciation of classical taste in North Africa during late antiquity. So the faces were likely not portraits. These head faces extend a practice from antiquity, depicting youth, elderly, and foreigners on wine and domestic vessels, so even like what we see in earlier Greek vessels as well. And the production of this fine ware shows the ways in which the African potters, like mosaicists, participated in the broader visual culture of the late Roman and early Byzantine world. So for the project, it's also been important for me to include Christian works that were specific to Africa. So these terracotta tiles from Tunisia represent such a body of work. And these tiles decorated walls and ceilings of basilicas in the Vandal and then the Byzantine period. And there's over 5,000 that exist from archaeological contexts. And the themes of the tiles are usually biblical or representations of animals or vegetable motifs, but often the style and iconography were a mixture of Byzantine, Vandal, and then Berber visual culture, so local visual culture. What's really interesting about these tiles is that the sizes of them are exactly 1 Byzantine foot by Byzantine foot. Notice the raised double edges. Those would have been inserted in ceiling beams. And then the tiles with the small columns with simple frames would have been inserted in the walls. But what's really interesting is that later types of these specific tiles are found in Cyprus and Iberian Peninsula about 200 years later. My projects have also considered late antique Judaism in Africa. A coastal town in Tunisia, Hamamlif, or ancient Nero, had a vibrant Jewish community. And these objects represent their rich material culture. And Jewish Africa challenges many of our assumptions about what Jewish identity or culture looked like in the Byzantine world. I've been particularly interested in this date tree motif across Africa and what the biblical story of the tree might mean for various communities. So when I was in Tunisia, one of my colleagues reminded me how important date palms are to the collective memories of the region. So for example, there's various uses of dates in northern and eastern Africa. So women would eat dates to quicken labor, and then dried palms are placed on graves. So this motif is a motif that replicated across the Byzantine world, but then also specifically in northern and eastern Africa. So we're moving to the next gallery, which focuses on Byzantine Egypt. And in this gallery are textiles, jewelry, ivory, and sculpture. As I mentioned, North Africa overall was an important aspect of the Roman and the Byzantine world. But the eastern and western parts of the northern African regions are rarely discussed together. So there's a language divide, right? The west spoke Latin, the east spoke Greek, but there's also disciplinary silos as well. So in my work, it's been critical for me to review Byzantine North Africa as a whole, though acknowledging that the region was divided into multiple provinces and geographical units. What's really interesting is also the connections between the Northern African region's provinces and the connections to the Byzantine world. So for example, in the 2nd century, the Roman province of Cyrenaica, which was right here, also included Crete. And the relationship between Crete and regions in Africa continued through the early modern period. And so towards the end of this discussion, I'll talk about more about these connections that continue between Crete and these northern African regions for thousands of years. But here, we're looking at a map of Egypt, which was strategically important to the Byzantine world due to its location as a connection between Western Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean Sea. It was one of the religious and intellectual centers of early Byzantium. So this is all to say that there is value in focusing on all the regions of northern Africa that were connected to Byzantium, geographically, politically, and even through trade. Many iconographic types began in Egypt. For example, Isis is largely seen as a precursor to Marian iconographies. And these devotional imageries often were items such as multicolored jewelry that were popular among elite women. And this panel that we see here is constructed from 2 vertical pieces of sycamore wood and has hinges. So you can see on the top and the bottom the hinges. And this indicates that it was probably attached to another panel, perhaps a portion of a diptych or a triptych. And it might have joined 1 or 2 other panels that are in the collection of the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, one of Serapis and one of unidentified man. So this composition is called the Getty triptych. It's still debated, and so it's actually one of the reasons why I didn't bring all 3 to the exhibition. But the Byzantinist, Thomas Matthews, suggests that Isis and Serapis panels compose the door of a domestic shrine. So these well-published works entered the Getty collection as a group. Later in the exhibition, we see this form, right, of a diptych or a triptych that's replicated in Byzantine, Coptic, and Ethiopian icons. And the form and style of the panel demonstrates the pervasive role of North African visual culture in constructing, but then also circulating images of the Christian faith in the Eastern Mediterranean. We probably know more about the wealthy in Egypt than members of other strata of the society. And this is simply the nature of the remaining evidence. For example, this funerary portrait is of a wealthy woman. You can see a juxtaposition of Greco-Roman and Egyptian styles here. And this represents this woman who was probably Greek-speaking, and she lived in the community in Middle Egypt. It was originally completely full-length and nestled into an architectural niche. And the textile is one of many found in Middle Egypt, where thousands of papyri written in Greek were also uncovered. So those documentary texts and papyri explain the daily lives and activities and concerns of the region's inhabitants. And this town, which was a Greek-speaking town, eventually became home to a vibrant Christian society where large communities of monks also lived inside and outside of the cities. Overall, I'm also interested in not only the wealthy and the things that they were and used in their homes, but I'm also interested in the daily lives aspects of the late antique Egyptians, the ordinary ones, such as, and I'm interested in how these people navigated their wishes and hopes and desires at home. Egyptians produced ritual protective texts alongside other religious objects in the late antique and medieval period. And there's a long legacy of scholarship on these types of texts called magical text. These are so-called spells, and they're found, they really have intrigued scholars for generations. They're found in Greek and in Coptic, and they usually ward off evil or request a favorable outcome, and they're on papyri like this, or ostraca, which is little bits and pieces of pottery fragments, or other textual objects. And certain materials had apoplectaic properties, and they were used as amulets and charms. These types of texts are not only really found in Egypt, they're really found throughout the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. But magic is not necessarily the most precise term for this corpus of material, which blur the lines between multiple faith practices. But still, scholars and the public often use the term for text or objects that do not seem to fit into traditional devotional and miraculous categories. But this text is really interesting because it's written into with two different hands. It's a charming Coptic text that is comprised of a love spell of sorts, and there's two. And there's one on the front and the other on the back of the papyrus. And the handwriting is really sloppy. But the front text, which it says, is instructions on how to acquire a beautiful singing voice. So the person who's using this is instructed to inscribe on a vessels different signs. So some of these signs are here. And then recite a prayer to an angel-like being. And the angel-like being, you can see him or her holding a trumpet, and it's emanating a series of Coptic letters. So the text surrounding the angels includes the preparations of the materials for the ritual and the acts that are needed for the ritual itself. So it says that you need the ingredients of a white dove's blood and musk for the ink. And the spell also requires the petitioner to write signs on the base of a chalice and then hang it from his neck, and then repeat series of greetings to the Trinity, archangels, the church, paradise, the sun and the moon and the stars and the gods. So he was really putting the whole kitchen sink, right, into the spell. And the petitioner had to ask the gods, for a beautiful singing voice 21 times. And so this is all listed here on this papyrus. But to implement the spell, the petitioner also had to inscribe a sheet of tin with a group of signs, and then mix wild herbs with the froth from the mouth of a black horse and a bat, and then also say, I beg you, by all of your holy names, with your offerings and your amulets and your thrones, which you set, I beg you all, by all of these things, for the sake of heartfelt love. So as in the case of this text, the distinction between devotional prayers and aggressive and protective magic was often muddled. But magic in Egypt is not only found in text, it's also found in objects. So here you see a kneeling woman in Jesus, depicting on one side of this small purple amulet. And on the other, a woman stands between two date palm trees with her hands raised in prayer. And this juxtaposition of female figures have led scholars to believe that the object was related to fertility. And the text and images recall the gospel story of the hemorrhaging woman, or the woman with the issue of blood. And the scene appears in multiple media, including paintings, ivory, sculptures, and amulets from the late antique to the Byzantine periods across the Mediterranean. In this story, a woman had been hemorrhaging for 12 years, and she exclaims that if she touched Jesus' clothes, she would be made well. And after doing so, she was healed. But she still trembled when she admitted to Jesus what she had done. So the connection between words, touch, and healing and fear is essential to this story. So this amulet is made out of a hard stone called hematite. And the stone is a result of an iron oxide compound that sometimes has a deep red or a red-brown color. It was thought to heal blood-related illnesses, burns, or liver diseases. In the natural history, Pliny the Elder suggests that this stone comes from Ethiopia. And he said that the stone, which also might have been a magnet, is found, which is a stone of a blood-red color. So in the late antique and Byzantine periods, the stone was also a popular medium for amulets related to female reproductive health. So overall, the material, text, and images together on this object point to the use of a balm for female issues. So while the term magic is not a precise descriptor for this object, the amulet represents the ways in which materials like rituals had miraculous properties. So shifting gears a bit, I want to talk about textiles. Late antique Egypt is known for its well-preserved textiles, and the exhibition has quite a few of them. Some of the most significant ones are textiles depicting Black figures. The original use of textiles had a domestic context, and they were likely curtains that separated spaces in rooms or decorated walls. So for the purposes of the exhibition, I've been very interested in the ways in which original elite owners would have viewed these textiles. Also here with the dancing Black figures in the homes. It was really a monumental opportunity to bring these works together, also to discuss issues of social class and ethnicity in late antique Egypt. For example, Black figures are represented on Egyptian textiles are quite fascinating. From the British Museum, there's a textile that has a theme from Ovid Metamorphoses, and it's one of the few from a corpus of Black figures drawn directly from Greco-Roman mythologies. And then also, I included this with the Met textile that has these really interesting Black mounted riders. And these textiles together bring forth topics of race in late antique Egypt, as the figures have different skin colors that are depicted on the textile. So in addition, highlighting these issues, these textiles also help explore the lasting impact of the classical past and the arts of late antique Africa. What's really interesting about this one is you can see Artemis here with the hunter companion. And then the figures here are a part of the Dionysian entourage. And so they're laughing and dancing and then singing. And to really understand the themes of this textiles, you would have had to known classical literature. Otherwise, it is just a group of figures that are just dancing and singing. And so there's a real interesting connection between education, identity, and social class in this period in late antique Egyptian communities. In the exhibition, there's also representations of Black people in decorative arts, such as this bust of an African child in the form of a typical perfume or incense holder. So examples of these types are found throughout the Roman Empire, in modern-day Britain, Portugal, Bulgaria, Germany, Syria, and Egypt. And they really attest to the Roman world's diversity. And these bronze vessels usually have two loops, a lid, and some evidence of a pedestal. And the vessels are distinctive in the ways in which they symbolize otherness. Mid to late 20th century scholarship of these figures usually describe them in really derogatory terms. But I think that these vessels are also quite elegant in the exhibition. And so one thing throughout the exhibition that I've done is bring in objects that have been well published, but really invite people to look at them in a different light. So for example, this small lamp is from a city in Algeria, and also belongs to a broader category of vessels that really were animated when it was used. So for example, you could have imagined that when there was fire, the fire would have gone out of the breath out of this vessel. A general consensus is that most of the Black people that we saw, so from the textiles, but then also the bronze vessels, were either Nubians or Ethiopians. So I want to turn to the African kingdoms below Byzantium. And I'm just going to give a brief background about those kingdoms. After the fall of the kingdom of Nubia, sometime in the 4th century, this region that we call Nubia was divided into 3 zones. John of Ephesus described the late antique territory between the First Cataract and the region of modern Khartoum as 3 separate and independent kingdoms. And we see no central stake for several centuries. And then there was different chronologies of these kingdoms that developed separately for each of them. And so these are the 3 kingdoms here, Nobadia, Makura, and Awa. Luxury products such as ivories were the mainstay of the kingdom's trade relations with the Mediterranean world. And so that's one of the reasons why these kingdoms were really wealthy, because they controlled the trade routes of ivories and golds that were coming out of sub-Saharan Africa that went up the Nile Valley. But then competition emerged between the various peoples in Nubia around late antiquity. And the Byzantine Empire was always viewed as this prosperous next-door neighbor during this turbulent period. So much so that the Nubian kings called themselves basilikores, or little kinglets, in contrast to the Basilias, the king in Constantinople. The lingua franca of Nubia was Greek for 1,000 years. And the Nubian royalty filled the tombs with remarkable artworks that seemed to fit more within a Hellenistic context than an African one. Now, its glistening bronzes and fine-ware pottery from Nubia are just a few of the luxury goods from the region. And in the exhibition, you'll see these magnificent wooden, ivory, and bronze boxes that really presents a new perception of late antique Nubian art production and sources. So all of this material relate to archaeological contexts uncovered from important late antique Nubian sites. And on them you see depictions such as goddesses, such as Aphrodite, and other figures in the Greco-Roman pantheon. And as I've explained, the Hellenistic societies in the late antique Mediterranean were closely linked to Nubia, but through not only language, such as Greek, but then literacy as well. One of the landmark objects in the exhibition is this 5th century chest from Nubia. And it really shifts perceptions about Byzantine art, production and sources in these regions. So this really assumes the form of a multi-storied house. The chest has 21 ivory panels, and on it you see depictions of Dionysus, Aphrodite, the god Bes, and the Greco-Roman god Zeus Ammon. The panels are decorated with a red and green wax paste. So we know that in the early Byzantine period, the presence of these mythological figures on everyday objects was not a reflection of the owner's religious background. Instead, their allegorical meanings often represented an appreciation of classical ideals that persisted in late antiquity. So generally, these boxes are ivory and bone, and they use inlays decorated couches and chests and other furnitures. But this box here, it was likely a bridal chest, and it was likely given to a bride on the occasion of her dowry, because the chest motifs relate to late antique ideas of fertility and prosperity. And these motifs are also found on boxes all throughout the Mediterranean, right? But this is just a very specific way of depicting the motifs. You know, this is really a Nubian context that we see here. So the late antiquity section of the exhibition also focuses on Christian Africa. Christianity has a long history in Africa. So North Africa was a birthplace of influential religious leaders, such as the father of monasticism, St. Anthony, who was from Egypt, and St. Augustine of Hippo. But by the 4th century, Christian communities in Egypt were flourishing. And in this part of the exhibition, I have objects from late antique Egypt, late antique Ethiopia, which was the second Christian nation, but then also objects from the monastery of St. Catherine of Sinai, because the monastery was a really important connector between these northern African communities and the broader Byzantine world. And so for hundreds of years, these African Christian nations were linked with Byzantium and engaged with religious, commercial, artistic, and even political dialogues across land and sea. The reason why I've highlighted the monastery of St. Catherine of Sinai in this section of the exhibition is because we know that the medieval Nubians and Ethiopians and Egyptians traveled to the monastery and saw icons such as this one. So we're so lucky to have this here in New York, and just for me, I actually go to the exhibition every single day and look at this icon because it is so different than when the reproductions of it. Like I feel like I never really saw it until I saw it in person. But the icon was possibly given to the holy monastery of St. Catherine of Sinai by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian when he ordered the site fortified and provided with a church, so between 548 and 565. It's made with encaustic, so that's this technique with wax and pigment that's built up on this wood icon. And you can see Mary, she's sitting on the bejeweled throne. She's wearing red shoes that are attributes of imperial imagery. And she's holding the infant Jesus on her lap, and she's flanked by the St. Theodore and St. George, and they're holding the martyrs' crosses, and they're wearing military dress. But then behind the stiffly formal figures, you see the two angels leaning backwards, looking upwards to link the seeing to the hand of God extending down from the heavens. And I I can talk for 1 hour about this object, and there's so many really interesting things about it. But when you go to the exhibition itself, really take a close look at even the painting techniques, because there's a real three-dimensional quality to the object that you can't see in reproductions at all. But overall, the exhibition explains how similar images like these remain popular for centuries from Constantinople to Ethiopia. The second section begins with Sinai as well. The holy monastery retained a deep connection to the imperial courts. So at the peninsula, at the intersection between Asia and Africa, Sinai housed some of the most significant art of the empire. So this section, Bright as the Sun, demonstrates how Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia respectively maintain relationships with Byzantium through their artistic engagements and reimaginings of Byzantine visual culture. In this section, I also talk about the relationship between these communities and the Islamic communities. As I mentioned, Islam became the dominant religion in the region by the 9th century. But these communities were closely connected to each other and their peers throughout the Mediterranean world through gift exchange and diplomacy. This part of the exhibition reveals the ways in which Northern and Eastern African artists use imagery, such as the imagery that we see in Sinai, to interact with different identities, such as the continued development and expansion of distinctive local forms of Christianity and Christian art in the region. And then, in addition to the Sinai icons, there's also exceptional Coptic manuscripts and icons, beautiful medieval Nubian wall paintings, and Ethiopian icons that juxtapose artistic styles from the Mediterranean. But overall, the section reflects on systems of periodization and explores questions such as where and when does Byzantium end? The remarkable objects in this section demonstrate the wealth and status of communities between the Mediterranean and the Red Seas, but then also give powerful expression to the values and systems of belief. The exhibition presents a unique opportunity to display a few manuscripts from the St. Michael collection, which is a group of 47 Coptic manuscripts produced between 823 and 914 CE. And these are currently in the Morgan Library and Museum, so you can visit them. The manuscripts were created during a time of intense precarity for monastic communities in Egypt. But the collection overall allows for a reconstruction of book production and collecting endeavors at this Coptic monastery over a 100-year period. And one thing that's really interesting about the monastery is that we know that the monks were, not just sitting with the monastic community, but they were really traveling across the Mediterranean world. One of the monks were hanging out in Constantinople and then went back to the monastery. So it's really interesting thinking about the circulation of not only these materials and books, but then also people as well during this period. But one example in the exhibition is this manuscript, which is now in the collection of Morgan Library. It was produced in 914 AD. And we know that the monks Kaufman and Stefan copied this manuscript because they write the names in the back of it. And they talk about themselves as calligraphers. But what's really interesting is when, for their notes that they write in the back of the manuscript, it was all in Greek. And so they talk about the names and the titles, but then also the dates of copying in Greek, even though the manuscript itself is in Coptic. But the manuscript includes the Homily of Incarnation, which is attributed to the 3rd century Demetrius of Antioch, and also the Homily of the Virgin Mary, which is attributed to the 4th century theologian Cyril of Jerusalem. But you see here the artist depicting Mary frontally, where Gabriel comes to Mary in order to announce the divine birth of her Christ child. And this is a common theme in Byzantine art. This visual translation of the Mary as Theotokos, which represents the one nature of God, meaning that he was divine from the moment of the birth. In this scene, Mary gently holds a spindle and a distaff in her left hand, indicating that she was spinning the purple thread. The iconography and style of the manuscripts are found throughout the Byzantine world, but then also these manuscripts link these Northern African manuscript production to the Mediterranean basin. The next gallery focuses on the connections between Nubia and Byzantium. In addition to their indigenous language, most Nubians were fluent in Greek, and that was the lingua franca, but then also Coptic, so Egyptian, and then later Arabic. The Nubian material and visual culture is really complex and fascinating. The Nubians built these monumental Christian churches, and the most famous one is a church called the Great Cathedral of Firas. And its wall paintings reveal Byzantium's connections to medieval Nubian art. And so I have a gallery dedicated to some of these wall paintings from Firas. And these paintings include numerous representations of bishops and dignitaries. And I think it's really fascinating how the art of medieval Nubia really challenges conventional understandings of Byzantine heritage in northern Eastern Africa. For example, here, there's a depiction of a 12th century dignitary. And he was probably the royal governor based in Firas. So on top, he wrote his title, which was eparch. And so this is the Greek word for governor of a province. And this title was used in the imperial Roman administration in the eastern parts of the empire, and then in the Byzantine Empire until 840s for senior administrative officials. But then after the 9th century, this title, eparch, was used for city governors into the 13th century, as the case for the Eparch of Constantinople. So it's interesting that this Nubian bishop in the 12th century is, not only appropriating these Byzantine styles in the wall painting, but then also appropriating these titles, these Byzantine administrative titles. Another interesting thing about this painting, and you really see it when you go into the galleries, is that he has a sideways gaze that also appears in Ethiopian paintings. And to make that link, I have a gallery of Ethiopian art, which is really an essential part of the story of the Byzantine tradition in Africa. And in the gallery, there's these painted wood panels and manuscripts from the early modern period that show the visual tradition of Ethiopian Christianity really flourished for thousands of years. And as I mentioned in the introduction, the Ethiopians were one of the first Christian nations after Armenia. And this sense of Christianity was really important for the Ethiopians' identity. But then in the medieval period, the Ethiopian kingdoms created their own African Jerusalem in places like rock-cut churches of Lalibela. And the artists crafted magnificent metal crosses that we have in the exhibition, within these delicately painted manuscripts that merge Byzantine prototypes with local visual idioms. There's also icons in the exhibition, such as this diptych pairing St. George with the Virgin and Child. And works like these provide fascinating insights into how Ethiopian artists responded to the changes in their religious culture associated in the 15th century when the emperor, whose name Zara Yakub, he made a declaration that Marian devotion prompted a surge. He made a declaration that prompted a surge of the production of panel paintings in a wide range of formats. So he basically said that Mary is really important to the Ethiopian church. And so we start seeing images of St. Mary and St. George together after the 15th century, after his declaration. What makes this diptych exceptional is this creative combination of distinctive painting styles. So while the image of St. George, whose white horse rears up as if to honor the image of the Virgin, reflects a local artistic practice, the right-hand panel was executed by an artist trained in a workshop closely connected to Italo-Cretan painting circles. In the exhibition, we not only have these juxtapositions between Ethiopian and Byzantine art, but then also these really beautiful manuscripts that are really deeply Ethiopian, such as this illuminated manuscript that was produced in the 15th century in a monastic production center in Ethiopia. And these manuscripts share certain distinctive features, such as these figures with elongated faces, and then they have these really fascinating textiles that are rendered with interlocking and geometric patterns. Here on the screen, you see the Virgin and Child with the archangels, Michael and Gabriel. And this manuscript exemplifies the exceptional quality of all the paintings the Ethiopian paintings in the exhibition. And you can see these vivid red and green and blue and yellow hues that show few signs of fading. When I was giving a tour to my colleagues in modern and contemporary, they didn't believe me that this was made in the 15th century. They said this must have been made 50 years ago because it's so well preserved. The final section of the exhibition addresses Byzantium's continued legacy in Africa and explores the ways in which artists of African descent continue to find inspiration in Byzantine traditions. And so in this section, you see these retranslations and memories of Byzantine art that continue to resonate from the medieval period to today. And these later works of art featured in this section create really a new framework for understanding these issues that are throughout the exhibition, such as identity, authority, even ethnicity, and belonging and memory among the African communities, African Christian communities. And these artworks illustrate also the limitations of conventional art historical periodizations, and they highlight the importance of really looking at a longue durée between the arts of Northeast Africa and Byzantium. And so these works in the last exhibition focus really on the 17th century to today. We can see these varied painting practices that are found throughout Northeast Africa. And I think that this part of the exhibition really surprises visitors who are not familiar with the material. So when you go through the exhibition, you'll notice a magic theme that is woven throughout the show. And so I talked about this papyrus in order to get a beautiful singing voice. But some of the last works in the exhibition focuses on these magic themes. These are scrolls that we call magical healing scrolls. And the aims of the scrolls can vary from curing those suffering from illness and misfortune, then also to lessen the effects of curses cast by those who wish harm. And these are really interesting because they were supposed to be rolled up really tightly, and you would have worn it next to your heart or put it under your pillow. And the length of them actually are probably the length of the person who owned the scroll. And so there's a real interesting connection between the body and the material and the text. To date, no scrolls made before the 17th century have been identified, even though they're mentioned as early as the 15th century in saint lives and church writings. To be effective, these scrolls had to be used daily, either worn on the body by day and night, or, as I mentioned, placed under the pillow. The Ethiopian amulet scrolls are made up out of parchment, and they're usually 2 or 3 strips sewn together, and they're rolled vertically. And they were kept in leather cases, and mere possession of them would have had a protective effect, as did reading their prayers out loud. The scrolls are often painted at the top with the image of a guardian angel or archangel with a sword drawn. And again, at the middle and the end of the scroll with imagery symbolizing good and evil powers. The artists in the exhibition, as I mentioned, I really bring this exhibition to today, and the artists I worked with for the exhibition were really inspired by these themes of magic. So for example, one of the artists I worked with created these textiles as almost healing scrolls. Her textiles mimic the format of the magic scrolls in the previous galleries. And she really reflects on the theme of healing and the power of magic. What's really fascinating about these scrolls is that she writes them in this language called Amharic. It's one of the Ethiopian languages, and she's Ethiopian-American, second-generation American, and she's not completely fluent in Amharic, even though she speaks it at home with her family. But she wanted to write it in Amharic, and she shared these prayers and magic scrolls with her mom. And her mom read them, and she was like, there's so many mistakes here. You can't actually do this for the Met because it's actually not grammatically correct. And so she really kind of leaned into that, the fact of thinking about diaspora and not being completely fluent in your mother's tongue. And so she had her mother correct the prayers on the scroll. And so it's a real interesting interaction between her mother and herself. And then she had her son make the translations of the prayers on the scrolls. And so it's this 3 generations of scribal activity. And we see this on all these medieval manuscripts too, right? And so I thought it was really interesting that she really leaned into this idea of mistranslation and what that means. We also have a video from an artist named Jaharis, and the video is about the return of the Axiom obelisk. And so in the 20th century, Mussolini, when he was in Ethiopia, he requested an obelisk to be taken to Italy, and that was remained in Italy until 2005, when the Italians repatriated the obelisk back to Ethiopia. Jaharis documented that return, and he was really interested in these themes of cultural heritage and memory and identity, but then also what it means for a large monument to move across land and sea. And it was really interesting talking to him about the exhibition, because we also have these really large monuments and architectural capitals and huge mosaics that were removed from their original context to different institutions. And so he felt that having this video at the end of the exhibition really allows the visitors to reflect what cultural heritage means to different communities. So overall, as you see when you go through the exhibition, the exhibition overall reveals the complex ways in which societies in the medieval period interacted. And it's a beautiful and inspiring exhibition with themes that I believe that are relevant to topics important to us today. But before I end, I just want to take us back just briefly to really talk about the context of this exhibition within the larger Byzantine exhibitions. So there was an exhibition in 1977 called The Age of Spirituality. It was curated by the curators in the medieval department, and then also a scholar named Kurt Weissman, who is a really famous artist during the Byzantine art. There's a lot of works in this exhibition. My exhibition was also in the Age of Spirituality. So for example, the beautiful textile, which is an icon, and what they decided to do was put it next to a replica of the 6th century icon. And it was funny because I've seen this picture throughout my graduate career. I've known about this exhibition so much, and I've always thought that the Met got these icons. And when I went to Sinai, I was like, well, you already lent to these icons to the Met. And Helen explained to me, like, no, those were reproductions, and they weren't able to get those icons for that exhibition. And so the reason why I'm showing this was just to explain that a lot of these artworks are familiar with us, and what the exhibition really does is to look at these artworks in a different light, and then think about more scholarship that can be had on these works of Northern and Eastern Africa. But overall, the exhibition really builds on the long legacy of exhibitions at the Met, and thinking about expanding the borders of Byzantium. And so with the glory of Byzantium in 1997, these relationships that I was able to use in order to bring in the Sinai icons, but then also works from Tunisia and Egypt. It was really because of this long legacy that Helen started. Byzantine Faith and Power also had works of art from Armenia and Ethiopia, Coptic works, and so even though I'm really focusing on this African story, the Met visitors was already primed for these stories and artworks that you see in Africa Byzantium. And so, as Helen mentioned, that this is, even though it's a new project and a new way of looking at the material, it's really an extension of what the Met has been doing, and I'm really looking forward to continuing this work in the future and thinking about the ways in which Byzantium connects globally for world history. And then finally, I just want to give a pitch to this catalog that I edited that had over 40 scholars contributing to it. And the reason why I wanted to have so many scholars is because, this is kind of a new idea about these connections between the communities in Northern and Eastern Africa. And so I really wanted to make sure that the exhibition was grounded in the newer scholarship. And so people like Helen Evans and Father Justin and important scholars such as Roger Bagnall contributed essays, but then also people who just recently received their PhDs who've been thinking about these topics in different ways also contributed. And so it really provides the state of the field of this connection. What's really interesting about the catalog is people really present the questions that are at stake in terms of the different terms that we're using and the different types of materials and evidence that we have. And so when you read the catalog, you can see all the research that has been done on this topic, but then also the research that needs to be done in order to continue thinking through these topics. And then I just wanted to show a picture of the travels I did for this exhibition and travels I did with Helen. We went to Monastery of St. Catherine of Sinai together, but then I also went to Tunisia and Ethiopia and Sudan in order to see this material in context and really understand the ways in which our colleagues in those areas understood terms of Byzantine, like the fact that they had Byzantine art in the galleries, and it's really helped me develop the exhibition overall. So I had those conversations, but then also I had conversations with members of various communities here in New York. And so I spoke with members of the Coptic, Greek, and Ethiopian Orthodox communities. And it was really great for me to understand the ways in which non-art historians and curators look at the material. And it helped me develop the didactic material, but then also thinking through the display of the exhibition. So that was the project, and I really hope that you come to the exhibition. You can see PowerPoint slides of this material, and I could talk for 5 hours about it, but it's really a phenomenal experience seeing these works of art that we're probably not going to see again. Especially the Sinai material, but even the material from Ethiopia and Tunisia. And it's such a monumental opportunity for us to spend time with these materials in the galleries. And so I look forward to seeing you all in the galleries because I'm there every single day looking at the Sinai icon. Thank you. So, thank you so much. So there's time for questions. And,
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you for your talk. This question is either for you, Andrea, or for Helen. I did see the exhibit recently, quickly, but I did not see the inside of the volume. So what I'm about to ask may be in the book, I just don't know. It was not in the exhibit. I wondered, I'm puzzled why, because books are an important part of the exhibit, I'm puzzled why there was a total absence of any mention, and Byzantium to me is early Christianity as I view it. there's no mention of the 4 codices, the most important ones that still remain, the complete New Testament and most of the Old Testament in Greek on vellum paper. 3 of the 4, except for the Vaticanus one, is reported to have been created in Egypt. And clearly that might have been a subject that you might have addressed. I wonder if you're preparing another exhibition and you give us advance warning of it, Andrea, but that would fit the bill. My second related question, if I may, is regarding one of them, which has a provenance, a deep provenance issue, the Codex Sinaiticus, I don't know how to pronounce it, but the one that was housed in St. Catherine's Monastery, where you have taken exquisite pieces for this exhibit. There's a provenance issue. I think we know that the Tsar of Russia effectively stole it, and the British bought it from the communist government later. And now 2 of these 4 stupendously important Christian documents exist in the British Library. So the Greek nation, if I can put it that way, has 2 arguments against the British government today. Not only the Eldred marbles, but repatriating the 85 to 90% of the Codex Sinaiticus that basically the Russians stole from St. Catherine's Monastery. So my question remains, why did you not mention these documents that were clearly a product, maybe not produced, because they may have been produced, one of them, the Vatican one, maybe in Anatolia, maybe the Alexandria one, but they were really housed in Africa over this period. And we're talking 4th century. We're talking 350 AD.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for bringing that up. You know, there's so many stories that I could have said within the context of the exhibition that are just as important as that. And in terms of thinking about the different documents that were produced in Egypt, but then also across the Eastern Mediterranean, at the end of the day, we could only house so many objects, right? And so maybe for my next exhibition, I can think more about that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited about this show, because people have asked these types of questions. And for example, when I was in the gallery in front of the Sinai icon, someone asked why I didn't focus also on the connections between these communities in Venice and also the Cretan communities. And you know, that's also a whole different exhibition in itself. And so I'm really excited about the potential of this work and thinking about, you know, the next 50 years of Byzantine exhibitions at the Met. So thank you.
Is there any progress, Helen? I know.
I don't know of any progress because the manuscript gospel pages that he's talking about were left Sinai with a monk to be studied, and then the monk was supposed to return them to Sinai, and instead he gave them to the Tsar. When the Bolsheviks took over Russia and eliminated all private property and all property of the Tsar, they went into libraries. When Stalin needed money, he sold things from the library, and the British bought them. And the monks quite rightly fully remember that they did not exactly give it to anybody. They lent it to a fellow monk who just neglected to return it. But they have found in a Russian institution, a thank you letter from the Tsar to the monks. and while all this sounds kind of silly, the Russian government provided food supplies twice a year to the monastery for decades and decades. So it's not like somebody came visiting on Monday and went home with it. It's got a whole history of supplies. Catherine the Great associated herself with Catherine of Alexandria. So there is a vast amount of they are, certainly the British Library is doing all it can to work with the monastery as opposed to ignore the monastery, which is a step forward. But I think it's not going to come back. That's my guess. Does anybody else have a question? Yes.
Yeah, I just want to know, how long is the exhibit? How long will the exhibit be at the Met?
Oh, March 3rd. March 3rd.
Oh, March 3rd.
And then it goes to Cleveland Museum of Art.
Okay.
How long is that at Cleveland?
It's until July 15th. So the Cleveland installation is from April 14th to July 15th.
Okay.
And all the Sinai icons are.
Okay. All right. Great. I have time to see it.
Yes. It looks quite beautiful at the Met. And it's also just really exciting since it's really easy to praise this show. It is Andrea's. I came along for bits of the ride, but it's wonderful to see the people that are going through it and to see the way people are looking at it and thinking and talking to each other. And the Sinai icon is on one wall, and the great tapestry that's the same theme in Cleveland is on the other one. We are all learning a great deal from working on the catalog and from seeing the actual works. She's right, the Sinai icon does not look at all like it photographs. It just doesn't. I don't know why they can't do a better job. Anyone else with a question? I'm coming.
How far in advance do you plan an exhibit, and how the whole process of repatriating them, like legally and insurance-wise?
I don't think she could hear you.
We've seen the exhibit and we thought it was tremendous, so we loved it. But my question is, how far in advance do you have to plan for an exhibit like this, and what is the process or the challenges of bringing these works of art for an exhibit to the United States?
Could you repeat the question?
We saw the exhibit and we loved it, so thank you again for organizing it. Can you hear me? My question is, how far in advance does it take to plan an exhibit such as this, and what is the challenges in bringing these works to the United States?
That's a really great question. So I started the project in earnest in 2018.
We can't hear you.
Yeah.
You need to back
Okay.
up.
I started the project in earnest in 2018. But I mean, a lot of the relationships that we had with the different institutions, I mean, they were long-standing relationships, so I didn't really feel like I started from scratch. But in terms of the idea of the exhibition, a lot of that came from my dissertation that I started really in 2013. And so this has been generating in my mind and in terms of both thinking about the objects and the narratives themselves for a long time. In terms of the interesting issues and problems in negotiating loans from these regions, I mean, from 2018 to 2023, so many things have happened, right? Like we went through COVID, and the world has completely changed, and so the checklist has shifted a little bit. But what was actually really interesting about the shift after COVID is that I was able to have more conversations with colleagues over Zoom. And so we were able to keep our travel budget just a little bit lower because I could just call someone over Zoom and have a conversation about these objects in a ways in which I think that before we didn't feel as comfortable having really important conversations virtually. And so that's one shift as well. But I think that the objects in this exhibition are so rare and phenomenal, and I'm just really grateful for the relationships and partnerships that the Met has built over, since 1977, and that's really like what we're seeing in terms of the products that you actually see in the exhibition.
So I saw the exhibit and I was really impressed. I enjoyed it very much. Especially I enjoyed the bright colors of the icons. And I would like to ask you, do we know the technique that they used so they are so bright so many centuries ago, that they were painted many centuries ago? Could we be able to find out how come they are so successful?
So in terms of which sorry, what?
Go to the microphone.
Oh, no, my question was which object?
Which object?
The icons.
The icon?
The icons.
Yeah.
So there's two 6th century Theotokos that I talked about. I wasn't sure which one, but for the 6th century icon, when you see it in person, you can actually see the use of it over time. You can see the soot that's on the bottom, and so when you look at it, you can see this damage on the bottom. And what's really interesting about it is it's the curvature of it, and so thinking about how it would have been in the monastery is really fascinating, because a lot of 6th and 7th century icons from Sinai are actually on really thin wood panels. And so, for example, the Louvre has some from Ukraine, and they look kind of very differently functionally from the icon that we have at the Met, because they're a little bit smaller and then the panels are thinner. And so for this icon, it was venerated for thousands of years, but then also one thing that Archbishop Damianos told me when he came to the Met was how sometimes they would have processions of that icon, and thinking about the icon leaving the monastery and then coming back, because icons like these represent, so he said, the future, past, and present for the monastery, and so that's one of the reasons why they allow the icons like that to leave. And so it's really fascinating thinking about the multiple uses of this icon over thousands of years.
Especially the red, I was very impressed by the red color. It was so bright that I don't know how they did it, the technique of creating such an impressive color, being so alive so many centuries ago.
I'm sorry. So you mean in terms of the technique?
The bright
of
color,
doing it?
why the color is so bright.
Yeah. Sorry, it's hard to see with this, with the light. But for the technique, it's something called encaustic. It's wax pigment. It's wax with pigment on it. And on the icon, there's also gold leaf that was burnished. And so when you're looking at the icon, this brightness that you see is really because of the technique of this wax. What's really fascinating about the gold part of it is that you can see this textual quality that has remained as well, and that kind of gives it this vibrancy that you're describing. And there's not only this burnishing on the gold, but then there's also stamped. And so I really encourage you to look at it very closely, because you can see the burnishing, but then you can also see the stamps on the nimmed the crowns. And it's really remarkable, the fact that it's so well preserved, as you say, but then also all of the material throughout the exhibition. I mean, even the late antique textiles have like these really vibrant colors, and the icons throughout the exhibition are just so well preserved. Thank you.